So today, the subject will be ancillary services. So very in brief, ancillary services are backup that you need in the system in case something goes wrong. There's two types of things that can go wrong in control system operations. One thing that's standard, it's been there since the beginning of the power industry, is load forecast errors. Usually, the way we plan generation is we look at what kind of day it is, what season, what's the temperature forecast for tomorrow, and so on, and we look at past year's data, we make a forecast for each hour, how much demand we're expecting in the system, and usually these forecasts are off by 3 to 5%. So it's a significant error, but it's tolerable. The last few years, many systems threw in renewable energy sources, so that renewable energy sources used to represent less than 0.5% of annual production. So it was like noise. It didn't even worry operators because there were a few experimental wind farms here and there in the network. So even if the wind didn't go the way they expected it, they didn't even care that these wind farms existed. But these days, for example, Denmark, there are hours where the Danish network has more wind supply than it has country demand. So if you don't get the wind forecast right, you are in big trouble. Things that could go wrong with wind production, for example, are you have very strong winds and the wind generators are producing at full output, and then the winds just become a bit stronger, they go above the mechanical threshold of the wind generators, the entire wind park shuts down, and you lose a whole wind park the moment that it's producing at its peak. So all of a sudden, when 20 or 30 or more % of the country's demand is satisfied by wind, which is so unpredictable, that becomes a real problem for balancing. So again, we categorize this as forecast error. So these are continuous types of disturbances. From our point of view, what we care in terms of quantitative modeling is that we can use time series to model these types of uncertainty. And then you have discrete events that can also happen. So you can lose generators in the network. In Chile, you have these big mining plants. So when a big mining plant fails, all of a sudden you have a very abrupt increase in a very abrupt decrease in demand, and that creates an imbalance. You can have transformers that fail, so you might be losing different parts of your network. And the way to deal with these problems is to carry extra generation. So the extra types of generation that we carry, we classify it in, it's like an onion. The operator has, think of having an army, and you have the first line of defense, second line of defense, and so on. Then the smallest changes that occur second by second are dealt with frequency control. So you have automatic controllers in the generators. They look at the system frequency. If the system, and it's easy to monitor that, if the system frequency drops below 50 Hertz, the automatic controllers throw more fuel into the generators increase output, and the other way around. So the control signal input is system frequency, and you have automatic control. We don't care about that in this class because this is not too interesting from a market point of view. The second line of defense is regulation. So there you look at your system every 5 seconds to every 1 minute. Different operators do it in different ways. And you make small adjustments. So if you are undersupplying, you increase the set point and the other way around. Then, so these two things are for little changes that you make adjustments very frequently, minute by minute at the latest. And then you have, for serious events, you have spinning and non-spinning reserve. So spinning reserve is generation that is already online. In case you lose a unit in the network, the other online generators are gonna increase their production to prevent a blackout. What differentiates spinning reserve from non-spinning reserve is that to get paid for spinning reserve, your generator has to be running already. If your unit is fast enough to start from off, then you can also get paid for reserve, but it's non-spinning reserve because you're off the moment that the bad thing happens. And then there's replacement reserve, which is a third line of defense. So the moment something bad happens, you start using these two types of reserve. So if another bad thing happens, you don't have anything left. So that's why you also have replacement reserve. That is, the moment something bad happens, you use these guys to balance, and you use replacement reserve to bring it online and cover up for these guys until they take care of the imbalance. And there is, from a market point of view, there's a substitutability. So generators that offer regulation tend to be very fast. So if they can offer regulation, they can also offer spinning reserve, and so on. If I offer spinning reserve, I can cover the needs of non-spinning reserve. So this is the highest quality, and it can substitute for this, this can substitute for this, and so on. And the fact that you have these 4 different products, and this can substitute for this, and so on, creates complications about how you price these products, and we'll see a specific example. So here's what I discussed in more detail. Regulation every 5 seconds to 1 minute. Spinning reserve, you have to be online. The requirement for spinning reserve is that if you promise me a certain amount of megawatts, I will only reward you these megawatts provided you can give them to me in 10 minutes. So for that reason, your ramp rate, the speed at which you can change your output, matters. A unit that has a capacity of 200 megawatts, if it's already producing 190 megawatts, can it offer a spinning reserve of 20 megawatts? Think of reserve as you have your production at a certain well, let's make it every 20 minutes here. So beginning of the hour, maybe you're somewhere down here, and so on. This is your, so this is all megawatts here in the y-axis, and this is time. This is the energy you're supplying for those 10 minutes. Reserve is the extra thing you can give in case another generator is lost in the network. So definitely, you cannot offer more reserve than this distance here.
The distance is the maximum that the generator can produce, no?
The maximum that the generator can produce is this.
Yes, but until when?
So, for example, in the example over there,
It's
200, maybe it has a minimum run level of 100. We will see minimum run levels in the unit commitment problem. So we haven't seen them yet, but a minimum run level is once you turn the generator on, it has to be producing above 100. Now, the reserve award it's going to get, if it's producing 120, it's not going to be 200 because it's already giving 120 megawatts of energy. So the extra space is the reserve. You look troubled.
No, it's 80.
It's 80, exactly. So the problem is that if my ramp rate, so the rate at which I can increase output is small, then even if I have extra space, I still won't get the award. If my ramp rate here is 5 megawatts per minute, then I can't get more than 50 megawatts reward, because within 10 minutes I can only go up 50 megawatts, not faster. Even if I have 80 megawatts space, I might still be limited by my ramp rate. Yeah.
And the per bond is only online generated, or also the offline?
If you are online, you can play in the spinning reserve market. If you are offline, you can still play in the market for reserve, but not spinning reserve. You can play in the non-spinning reserve market. And there the definition is how much can you give me in 10 minutes, given that you're offline. If you have a fast unit, and you can turn it on and go up to a certain megawatt level within 10 minutes, you can get that reward for non-spinning reserve, non-spinning reserve. For example, nuclear generators would never participate in a non-spinning reserve market because it takes 2 weeks to start them. So that's not very useful. In fact, nuclear generators are never used for reserve. They're too, basically you turn them on and you leave them on at that level. So big players in the reserve markets are hydro. If hydro, you can just open the dam and its ramp rate is unlimited, basically. You can get in 10 minutes as much increase as you want or decrease. And it's considered to be an online resource. And then gas generators are very fast also, and they can play in the reserve markets. Recently with smart grids, the idea is to also make consumers play in the reserve markets. So if I lose a big unit in my system, I have a bunch of smart gadgets in people's houses. You send a control signal, they drop consumption. But that's kind of, for the moment, it's a bit futuristic. It's an experimental phase in the United States and in Denmark, but not really implemented in markets. Okay, so this is what the optimization problem looks like. So no transmission constraints, and here what I'm modeling is only spinning reserve. So the dispatch problem when you're accounting for reserve is almost like the economic dispatch problem we saw. I've removed transmission constraints, if you notice here. I've maintained the production equals consumption constraint. And I've added a spinning reserve constraint, a spinning reserve variable here. So what is this constraint doing here? This is basically what I described over here. So this is SG, this is PG, and the sum of the two cannot be more than your capacity, because we can't give more than that, even if something bad happens. Now, there might be a limit on how much reserve you can give, which has to do maybe with your ramp rate. And there is a minimum spinning reserve level that the operator needs to buy to make sure that the system is operated safely. These reserve levels are decided on a daily basis by the operator, because the operator knows very well what level of security they want. So they basically define the demand for this product. And given that you want to satisfy this demand, you solve the welfare maximization problem. Now, if you think about what is the optimal solution to this problem, it's very similar to the economic dispatch problem. So if I gave you a bunch of numbers and I asked you, I gave you a bunch of generators, some are cheap, some are expensive, and I gave you a certain level of total spinning reserve requirement. For the optimal solution of this problem, which generators would you prefer to use for reserve? The cheap or the expensive ones? For reserve. If you use the cheap ones for reserve, they won't be able to offer energy. And you will be forced to use the more expensive ones for energy. But the expensive one, you're paying, basically, it's a part of your objective function. You don't lose, there's really no cost in providing reserve in the objective function. It's just only a function of your energy output. So the preferable thing to do when you have a bunch of cheap and expensive units is use the expensive ones to satisfy this constraint here, and whatever capacity is left, use it to solve, to satisfy demand. Which is what I'm saying here, basically. So here's a specific example. We have 4 units, 250, 230, 240, and 250 are their capacities. And they're ordered, they're indexed in increasing, in order of increasing costs. So cheapest unit, second cheapest, and so on. Now, the first and the fourth unit they cannot offer any reserve. And the second and third unit can offer 160 and 190 respectively. And I want to make sure I satisfy 250 megawatts. And the valuation is high, which means I basically, in the optimal solution, I want to satisfy all of my demand. So, which unit would you use first for satisfying the reserve requirement? Fourth? Third? Benoit, you see why it's not the fourth? It can't offer reserve, maybe because of ramp rate constraints. How much would you offer from the third one? $250, 40. That's its capacity, right? But right. So you max it out, and the rest has to come from the next unit that can offer spin. So this guy will have to offer the rest. The rest is 60 more. It can offer it because it's within its limits. So now you're left with the energy part. And which one do you use first? The first one, and so on. You go then in order of increasing cost. Okay. Looks reasonable. I can be forgetting your guys' names. Again, Maxim and good. Okay. So it looks okay? Okay, cool. So this is basically, you can write out the optimization problem, and I have these multipliers over here that are the dual multipliers of the problem. And this is the argument we just went through. Only 2 and 3 can supply reserves, but none of them can satisfy them on their own. So basically, we max out generator 3. We then cover the rest of the reserve with generator 2. The other 2 guys can't offer any reserve. And then we start satisfying the energy from the cheapest unit, using as much as possible of the rest of the units. So this is the optimal solution. And we have the sensitivity of the energy balance constraint is $28 per megawatt hour. Why do you think? What's the rationale of coming up with this number? Think in terms of sensitivity. How would you satisfy an extra megawatt of demand? Which of the 4 units? This one. The problem is it's already out. Yeah.
The cheapest that isn't already.
The cheapest that isn't already out of capacity. So this guy is at 230, which is its limit also. This one is at 240, which is its limit. So you're only left with this guy. So, and if you remember, 28 is the cost of the most expensive unit in the network. So that's where the lambda is coming from. Clear? Because the dual optimal multiplier is the sensitivity of this constraint here. So if I increase demand by 1, how much does my demand function change? So to satisfy an extra unit of demand, I need to use whichever unit is free, and that's the most expensive one, unfortunately. And then here's the, at $11 per megawatt hour is the value of the reserve constraint. I don't want to show you the solution. So how would you think about calculating through sensitivity the...
It's giving one more second generator, so you have to put one back of the production and put it in the fourth one. So
Exactly. So what's the change?
So it's minus 1 megawatt in the cost of 2 and plus 1 in the cost of 4.
Exactly. So this is 28. This, if you remember, was 17, which is where the 11 is coming from. You increase reserve requirements by 1 megawatt, I have to give it from 2 and make up for the lost energy from 4. That's where the 11 is coming from. Okay. Okay, so back in the days when we didn't have markets, all of this was done centrally. You had this information, you solved it centrally, and you decided how much each generator will produce. The problem now in markets is that you need to decide what markets to define and how you will set up an auction to reward people, make sure that they, given the prices you send them, they will do the right thing. So again, if you've seen this, if you notice, this is a consistent pattern that we're going through in the course. We first describe a central optimization problem, and then we ask ourselves, how can we create a market around it? And the material I'm going to cover next is a bit abstract, but it's exactly the idea you use to set up a market around these situations, because the complication here is you have 2 different products, right? Generators, when they decide to play in a market, they can decide between production and reserves, and they're, depending on how much you pay them for each, they will do different things, and you want to make sure you find the right prices so that they give you what you want them to give you. Clear? If I pay for reserve too much, no one will sell energy to me. They will all sell reserves and I won't have any energy in my network. So finding the right price is the name of the game in energy and reserve markets. So I will present to you an abstract framework for selling multiple products, and then that will give us instructions about how to set up a market for reserves. So here's the abstract framework, and we've basically seen this already. We've seen it in transmission pricing and we will, we've basically seen it in, this is the same argument that I used in LMP pricing. Okay, so the problem we're looking at is basically a problem of maximizing an objective function where you can separate this objective function. It's separable in the sense that there's a bunch of agents and each of them has an individual cost or benefit. What are the agents in the problem we just saw earlier? Does our objective function look like this in the problem we saw earlier? There were two types of agents, loads and generators. That's a very specific structure of the problem. So first of all, we have a cost or benefit function that only depends on that load or that generator. And it's only a function of decisions that have to do with that load or that generator. That's already a very specific structure. So my benefit doesn't depend on how much someone else consumes or what the pattern of consumption is. It only depends on how much I consume. Similarly, my cost only depends on how much I produce. So that's already a very specific structure. Then there's a bunch of constraints that are specific to what I do. For example, this constraint here, production plus reserve, less than or equal to my maximum output, that's something that is an operating constraint unique to me. There's no decisions of other players involved in satisfying this constraint. So you have separable objective functions, you have a bunch of agent-specific constraints, and then there's these two annoying constraints that create dependencies. You have one equality constraint for production equals demand, and there you cannot look at variables separately anymore. All the variables, all the decision variables of all the agents are involved in satisfying this constraint. Similarly, for the reserve satisfaction constraint, you have, again, here everybody's decisions are involved in satisfying this constraint. If you think about it, if you didn't have these two, this problem would be very simple. How would you solve it? Would you look at it as a whole? You can let everyone do whatever they like to do. So the idea then, the issue is that these are the constraints that create the difficulties. And we will, so what I'm going to propose as a way to coordinate this system is to forget about these constraints, still let everybody do whatever they like to do, but add penalties in the objective function, and depending on how you adjust these penalties, you make people do what you would like them to do over here. So, inspired by the fact that if these were absent, then if you let everyone do their own thing, they would do the optimal. I'm gonna, maintain that idea of letting everyone do whatever they like to do, but I'm gonna add some terms here in the objective function to make sure that if they are killing these constraints, they get punished for it, and they change their decision to make sure that these constraints are satisfied. Okay, kind of abstract, but okay. So, to decide what penalties to add here, I will use as an inspiration the KKT conditions. So what are the KKT conditions of this problem? We have primal constraints over here. We have complementary slackness. I don't have a complementary slackness for AX equals B because automatically it satisfies complementarity. And then we have the gradient with respect to the x's. Now, this condition here has a very specific structure. And in fact, I think I'm missing the sign for the dual multipliers. I forgot that and I will change it. Sorry about that. Okay, but this condition here has a very specific structure. When I'm taking the gradient of this function with respect to the whole vector x, this thing will be all zeros except for that part that involves decisions of player x. So that's what I'm denoting by gradient with respect to of xk, and the rest will again be zeros. That's what's showing up here. And then the same here. Anything whenever whenever I'm taking the gradient with respect to x, and that part of x doesn't correspond to agent k, that part of the vector disappears. So we're left with this thing. And from the equality constraints here, I'm only left with the columns of x that have to do with decisions of agent k. So what ak denotes here is, if this is the whole matrix A, ak is the part of it that has to do with decisions of agent x. It's the columns that have to do, that contain decisions of player k, sorry. And the same for the ck over here. So this is the collection of KKT conditions, and I denote this as the primal dual optimal solution. So the solution that solves this KKT set here. So let's think about how we would like to set up a penalty system where I let you do whatever you like to do, but but I'm going to add some penalties if you screw up the coupling constraints. Let's change the objective functions a bit. If you look at what each individual player would be doing if they were left alone, they would be solving this problem here. And I think I'm representing the xk as negative as well. No, I don't know. That's what they would be doing if they were left alone. You already have some information here about a good way to change this objective function to make sure that they satisfy the KKT conditions of the global optimization problem. And the hint you have is basically here. What will happen if I let you violate equality constraints, but you're going to pay this much to violate them. And I let you violate the inequality constraints, but it's going to hurt. You have to bribe yourself to violate. You'll have to bribe me to violate the inequality constraints. So setting up an optimization problem, and now given we change a bit the optimization problem of each agent and let them solve this instead. So we create a rule where we say, okay guys, you can do whatever you like, but you will have to, depending on the X you decide to do, you will have to pay this much and then this much. Okay, here's the new situation I present to each of the different agents. And the question now is, what will they end up doing? So to understand that, and this is the problem I just described, basically what I've done here, and I should write this out like this, sorry. Basically what I've done here is for each coupling constraint, for each complicating constraint, I've defined a price. For equality constraints, I've defined a price lambda. And for inequality constraints, I've defined a price mu. And I've made you pay your contribution to the left-hand side for that constraint. From the point of view of someone who's okay, I'll just leave it at that. So for each complicating constraint, I've basically defined a price. So we get this optimization problem here, and you get these KKT conditions here, which there's a typo, these should be minuses as well as this. Yeah. Sorry, I'll correct that. So I should correct here, these should be minus signs, but the important thing to note is that if I change the optimization problem of agents to this form, and I plug in the lambdas that I got from the solution of the global optimization problem, these constraints here are a subset of the constraints that show up here. So suppose I had the solution to this global optimization problem. Can you see why the part of X that refers to agent K combined with the lambda star and the mu star, can you see why those would solve this KKT system here? These are a subset of the constraints of the global optimization problem. Okay, these constraints appear identically in the global optimization problem. It's this one over here, and that one, and this one over here. Which means what? If I set up a way to organize our system where I give you the freedom to do whatever you like, but I price the complicating constraint by lambda star and mu star, deciding X star, the globally optimal thing, will actually maximize your benefit in this changed problem. And that creates the idea for setting up an auction. So the idea of the auction is that I will let you do your own thing, maximize your own profits. But what's going to happen is I'm going to collect from you your data, so the stuff that has to do with your operating constraints, so that I can solve a centralized optimization problem. When I solve the centralized optimization problem, I'm going to use the dual multipliers as prices for you. And I know that the optimal thing to do will also be optimal for you when I use those prices. Does that make sense as a setup? So again, I ask you, what are your operating constraints? Those are the bids that you will give in the auction. I collect from everybody their bids. I solve this problem here. I take the optimal lambdas and the optimal mu's, and then I come back to each of the players and tell them, okay, these are the prices for this product. And for those prices, profit maximizing agents will do exactly what I want them to do. Now, this sounds kind of abstract, so let's see, and I'll return to the Uplift example, but let's see a specific example of this in action. Oh my, I didn't include the example. Okay, but it's okay, I can. Let's try and, I haven't included it in the slide, but let's try and solve the example. So for the case of the generators here, what would the, first of all, how many different markets would we have? How many communicating constraints are there? Where are they? You're think these ones, right? So there's two products. There's two complicating constraints. We define two products. One product is energy, one is reserve. Okay? So we will create two different markets, and generators can sell either in the energy market or the reserve market. And let's think of the problem of, for example, of generator 1. And the generator 1 can also participate in the reserve market. So if you want to participate in that market, you get paid a lambda, you get paid a mu, and you have a fuel cost of 2. Your production limit is 250, and really you can't produce any reserve. So, what is the optimal solution? Yes?
Why do you need that with a fixed of 2?
Here? That's the operating cost. It's the FK of XK of this guy. Okay, you saw it with the
first guy.
this is the first generator, exactly. Okay. So for this agent here, what is the optimal P and the optimal S? I let this guy play both markets for energy and reserve. And somehow magically, out of my pocket, I pull out two numbers. I propose that we pay this guy $20 per megawatt hour for energy and $11 per megawatt hour for reserve. What is the optimal reaction of this profit maximizing player for these market prices? First of all, even if you wanted to, can he get any reward from reserve? Generator 1 is stuck. He doesn't, maybe it's because of ramp rate, but in any case, he can't offer reserve. I propose you guys move here afterwards, or even now if you want. Because, yeah, go for it, because it's like torture. So, what would this guy do for $20 of energy reward? It would max out, right? It's costing him 2, but he gets paid 28. The optimal reaction for these prices is 250. What a coincidence, this also happens to be the optimal solution of the centralized problem. It's not a coincidence, it's exactly the argument that I used earlier for through the KKT conditions. Okay, that's for generator 1. So let's do generator over here. So for generator 2 we have fuel cost was 17. Lambda P plus mu S subject to 230 and 160. So for 28 and 11, this guy can offer reserve so for this guy now it's a question of whether he prefers to offer reserve or energy. So here I'm going to use this local perturbation argument. The optimal solution for P2, the centralized optimal solution was 170 and 60 megawatts of reserve. Okay. So I claim this is the optimal solution also for this problem here. Let's try and formalize that claim. What happens if I perturb this solution slightly? So what happens if I give a bit more instead of reserve? I give it for energy, or the other way around. So let's think of what happens if I end up moving to 171 versus 59. How much do I gain from this change? For these prices? 20. Why? 11. Because?
It's 28, I guess.
Minus the fuel cost. Exactly. So this is plus 11. But I moved out of the reserve market by 1. So I lost 11. So basically, it's a stationary point. I'm indifferent between both changes. This indicates for a linear program that it's optimal. Stationary point in a linear program means your gradient doesn't become better. So this is an optimal solution. You can also put this in ample for these specific numbers and confirm that this is indeed an optimal solution. The important thing is that these price signals don't make you want to move away from this. They support this as something optimal to do. Clear? For generator 3, for example, here in the same example, if the reserve price were 1 cent more, 11.01, this guy would want to do a very different thing. This guy would prefer to offer 160 megawatts of reserve and whatever is left, 70 for energy. And that's way off of what I want him to do. I want him to do this. And these are actually the only two prices that will make him do this. And again, the same exercise for generator 3 we have, okay, for generator 4 it's kind of obvious, so I won't bother doing it. For generator 4 he cannot offer reserve, and the energy price is 28, so he's indifferent whether he produces or not. It's the same for him because whatever revenue he makes from energy, he loses in fuel cost. So if you ask him to produce 0 or his maximum, it's the same for him. You can ask him to produce anything in between. Okay, and for generator 3, it's minus 20B, and we have okay, so would this guy be willing to change his output? So this guy's optimal output was 50, and the reserve price and the reserve output is 190. Okay, so what would happen for this guy if he decreased reserve by 1 and replaced it with production? So if he moved to 49, that would bring in profit of $8, right? Because his fuel cost is 20, he's getting paid 28. So if he increased, well, that can happen. So suppose he goes 51 and this goes to 189. So if he increases production by 1, he has a benefit of $8 per megawatt hour. Is that clear? His 28 is income from energy, and then he's losing 20 on the fuel. But by decreasing output from the reserves by 1, he is losing 11. So this guy doesn't want to move out of the. He likes his position in the reserve market. He wishes he could produce more in the reserve market, but the reason he's not doing it is because he's already producing at maximum. So hopefully, I've just convinced you that these prices make these guys want to do what you wanted them to do in the first place by solving the centralized problem. You buy it, the whole argument I played. Okay, so what did I do? The trick I played computationally was I collected everybody's data, I solved a centralized optimization model, I picked up the dual optimal multipliers of the complicating constraints, and sent these as signals in a market. And that basically gives you the instructions for how to organize markets for multiple products. And this is really electricity markets. They are multi-product auctions. You have single generator that can offer a spectrum. You can generalize this idea in anything you like if you think about it. When you have different agents that can sell you or buy from you different goods, you find the complicating constraints, create markets for them, and then have them bid their information, solve a centralized problem, and send back these the dual multipliers as price signals. So the recipe for creating a market when you have multiple products is exactly that. Every complicating constraint is a different product. Here we have two, energy and reserves. In the optimal power flow problem, we have as many as the different buses. So each different product is the energy in every location. So basically LLP pricing is exactly the same idea, just for transmission constraints. Not surprisingly, you can combine these two and create even more complicated options. But the recipe is this. You find a complicating constraint, define a product for each complicating constraint, ask everyone to bid their information, solve the central problem, send back the dual multipliers as prices. That's the recipe for setting up the market. Okay. So one hat is the optimization expert hat, where you see a problem with separable objective function, complicating constraints, and you think that you're thinking complicating constraints. That's what makes the problem difficult. From the point of view of an economist, each complicating constraint is a commodity market. What is a commodity? It's a product that receives the same price, that buyers pay the same price for. So it's something that's something that's traded at the same price. And indeed, in our example, we had a single price for energy, a single price for reserves. And we described this recipe for setting up this commodity market. Now, my claim is that this is a great way to organize people to do what you want them to do. So indeed, we set up a decentralized system. The system operator didn't have to worry anymore about running everybody's operations. They just had to run an optimization problem and announce prices. But there is a practical issue with this auction. There is money coming in and money being paid out. How much money do you receive when you are the auctioneer? How much do people pay you, and how much do you pay out? You had this set up here. So people are basically here, all you see is, these are all payments, right? Because we have a maximization problem and you're subtracting out stuff that's proportional to my decisions. So these are payments. So for example, if I'm a buyer, Fk is my benefit function, X is positive demand, and I'm paying this much. If I'm a consumer, F is equal to minus my fuel cost, and my X is a negative, my X is positive, but my A, the coefficient, my contribution to the power balance constraint I raised it, has the opposite sign. So the total payments is the sum over all agents, the sum over all K, of lambda transpose AK XK. That's how much you're collecting, plus the part that has to do with the mu transpose CK XK. That's how much you're collecting in terms of payments from everybody. If you sum that over all agents, the total payments you get are lambda minus lambda transpose AX plus mu transpose CX. That's the sum over all agents. If you send them the optimal price signal, which is the lambda star of the centralized problem, and they react with the optimal X, the X star, you know from strong duality that, you know from complementary slackness something. So your payments are this much. What is this equal to from complementary slackness? For this, what are the complementary slackness conditions for these constraints here? These constraints have the lambda multiplier associated with them. These constraints have the mu multiplier associated with them. What does complementary slackness say for the optimal lambda and X? For this, to change this, you don't even need complementary slackness. Cool. Oops. Plus.
You start.
Perfect. So this is the total collection of payments from the auction. That means that it's possible when the right-hand side of the complicating constraints are non-zero, there is money, either some money left on the table, or you receive more from people who are paying than you're giving out. So the organization that runs the auction has a deficit. For this constraint here, is this a problem? How much is the net of... So buyers pay for energy, producers are paid for energy. Is there any imbalance there? Let's think of the example we had. There was a price of $28 per megawatt hour. What was the total production? If you add up the numbers from the example, these numbers will add up, in fact, to the total demand. So, these guys that are producing this much are paid $28 per megawatt hour, but the total production is equal to the total demand. So the guy who's buying that demand pays that. So all the auctioneer is doing is taking money from the loads, pushing it to the producer. No money left in the table in the process, because the right-hand side constraint here is 0. But for the reserve part of the auction, there's an issue, because I paid the generators to give reserves. I paid them $11 per megawatt hour. So this guy gets 60 times 11, this guy gets 190 times 11. The load didn't pay for that. The way I organized this auction is, again, if you follow the recipe I showed you earlier, there was no payment term for reserves from the loads. They only paid for energy. So I have to pay the generators for the reserves, but I never received a payment from anybody, so that creates a deficit. That's a practical problem in multi-product auctions. And what happens in reality is, in the end of the year, we start paying the loads over the year for all the reserve contribution, and at the end of the year, each of us gets a little increase in our bills that is referred to in the bill as other services, and that's this stuff, among other things. So the loads get the charge back at the end of the year, but it's just spread out uniformly over everybody's electricity bill. So so you can identify immediately these cash imbalances in multi-product auctions when you see complicating constraints that have non-zero right-hand sides, because the origin of the imbalance over here was this guy. The D was non-zero, and you had a price for it. So you know that the total payments of the auction will equal this. If the D had been 0 for the complicating constraint, we would have had a balanced auction without uplifts. Okay, this imbalance here is called an uplift. It's cash that the auctioneer, the system operator, has to come up with and pay it out to everyone who's participating in the auction. Okay, so that's the whole discussion about setting up multi-product auctions. Now, the reality in the industry was that until a few years ago, just solving this problem was too difficult computationally. The problem was too large, the solvers were not fast enough to deliver solutions for the market on time. You need to solve the whole problem to come up with the lambdas and the mu's. A few years ago, we had amazing progress with integer programming solvers and industrial scale problems. We could solve them within an hour, for example. So then we could all of a sudden run co-optimizations like this and create markets around them. And there is a video that I will suggest for you to see of the Midwest independent system operator that participated in the Edelman competition. That was in 2008, I think. The Edelman competition is a high-profile competition of the Informed Society, the Society of Operations Research, that's awarded to companies that use applied operations research to save big money. So the Midwest ISO showed them how they changed their operations to do co-optimization of energy and reserves and saved, I think, within 3 years, they reduced their operating expenses by 7 to 10 billion. Well, no, the estimation was that within 13 years they would reduce their operating expenses by 7 to 10 billion dollars. So introducing the co-optimization in a power system is one of the real examples where OR makes a difference for the industry. Once the solvers became fast enough to do co-optimization of energy and reserves, simultaneous markets, simultaneous auctions were created around these problems. Before that, before solvers were fast enough to solve co-optimization, we did things sequentially. So we ran a separate reserve market, we cleared reserves, and then we ran an energy market. In an optimization problem, when you're doing things sequentially, and you're taking a global optimization problem and first solving one part of it, fixing it, and then solving the rest, that tends to be a non-optimal solution, right? When you have a for example, very silly example of a suppose I have, I'm coming up with this now, so it might come out to be really stupid. So let's say that yeah. Okay, this is indeed stupid. This will, even if you solve this one sequentially, you will get the optimal solution here. But let's think of a situation where I'm solving X first. Anyway, I'll come better prepared next year for an example like this. But typically, you can have something that involves multiple variables. You ignore whatever has to do with the second stage, for example, Y. You solve only this first. You come up with a decision X. You fix it, and then you solve the rest with the X fixed. That can lead to suboptimalities, typically. Not in this example, because in this example, if I ignore X, I'm going to pick 0. And then when I solve for Y, I'm going to set it to 0, so it's the same result. But yeah, I'm sure it's not hard to come up with a different decision. How about, yeah. Anyway, so what I'm going to show you now is how markets were set up before co-optimization and some of the problems that came up with it. One issue was suboptimality. The other issue was bad pricing.
If you just did a break greater than -2, and you solve first the graph, and then what's...
You're saying we're doing minus? A minus, huh? Yeah, that's, I thought of, so then I would set X to 0, and then Y would be unbounded. Yeah, which is also the optimal solution for this. So, something like this. Sorry. Does that work? That works. It does worse.
Yeah, it does work, no?
So I would pick in sequential, I would do this.
But first we begin by
Oh, by solving y.
y.
Okay, so if I solve y first, I would pick 10. And then the x can go anywhere it likes. So I would pick 0, right? And that is suboptimal. The optimal is 0, 0. Okay.
No, the optimal is minus 20, so it's the optimal.
It's the optimal, yeah. Yeah, for some reason it's trickier than people think. Anyway. Okay, so sequential auction. So the idea is first trade reserves, then trade energy, and two bad things can happen. You can get an inefficient outcome or bad prices. We'll see bad prices in the examples that will follow. Okay, well, the idea when reserve markets were being set up was that we will do reserve markets in sequence, starting from the highest quality market, and any bids that are extra, we will send them to the next quality market because, for example, regulation can substitute for spinning reserves. So if you can offer me regulation, then that same bid can be used for spinning reserves. So I should run the regulation market first to make sure that the extra goes to the next level. If I did it the other direction, you can see how things, it's not a good idea. Because, for example, if I have an enormous quantity of available regulation and only this much is needed, the rest can substitute for spinning reserve, for example. But if I solve for the spinning reserve auction first, the regulation bids, assuming the regulation bids were not considered, then I would only be considering a very small subset of my fleet. So the idea was let's run the highest auction first and move any extra bids down to the lower levels. And that was used by the Midwest system operator in California before 2005. So the setup, the name of the game is you give me block bids the same way you did for energy markets. So how much megawatts and at what price? Okay. Now the demand side, there is no active buyer. If you remember in economic dispatch, we had valuation bids. For reserve markets, it's really the operator that knows how much they need. So the demand is a fixed quantity, and we're just going to take the cheapest bids first until we satisfy the quantity. Sounds reasonable? Okay. The price that will be awarded is the intersection of the supply and demand curve, and once we clear the regulation market, any extra bids go to spinning reserve and so on. So here's an example of how that works. Here we have two bids for regulation. The total demand for regulation is 500. The first bid for regulation is 600 megawatts at $10. The second bid for regulation is 100 megawatts at $15. And then there's two bids for spinning reserve, but these guys can't offer any regulation, they're only for spinning reserve. So there's one bid at 200 megawatts, I don't know, that's $5 or something, and 300 megawatts at whatever, 17, I think, maybe 20. What is the clearing price for this market? 10, yeah. So at 10, this guy is too expensive, he's not willing to sell for that level. This guy is indifferent when you pay him 10, so you can ask for him as much as you want, so you'll ask exactly, I think, yeah, 500. And then these two guys that are left over, they cascade to the spinning reserve market because they can offer it. If you can offer regulation, you're fast enough also for spinning. So you get a supply curve that looks like this. Yeah, this is the cleared. This figure is just this cleared at 500. So when you cascade these two leftover bids and you plug them into this supply curve, they enter here and here. This block gets moved to the right because he's more expensive. When you clear this market, in fact this is 20, so it clears at 20. Now what's the really weird thing here about prices? Thinking practically about low quality products and high quality products. What would you expect when you're selling a low quality product and a high quality product to happen?
Low quality should be cheaper.
Right.
High quality is
It's double the price. That creates really bad incentives for the traders who are selling green energy. If I own a generating unit that can offer regulation, it's really fast, but I'm seeing a market that's for and a product that I can also sell. Since I can offer regulation, I can also offer spin. I'm gonna misrepresent my costs, so I'm not cleared for regulation. And I'm just gonna, I'm gonna say I'm too expensive for regulation. I'm not gonna be cleared for regulation, and I'll be cleared for spin, because I'm observing that the spin market is twice more lucrative. But really, the operator wants me in regulation because I can offer it. I'm one of the few units in the system that can offer it. So you definitely want to avoid creating a market that is pricing lower quality products at a higher price. It screws up your incentives about saying the truth in each auction. Okay, now if you run this, the first day you run it, it's going to be okay. If people tell you the truth, you are. And what is the optimal solution for this problem? Given I need to satisfy 500 and 500, who would you take the 500 regulation from? Assuming these were their true costs of supplying these services. So what's the lowest cost way? This is the cheapest guy for satisfying regulation. The next cheapest thing to use is this. Then the next cheapest thing to use for spinning is this, and so on. So indeed, this selects the cheapest way to go. But the problem is, after the 10th day that you play this auction, traders will understand this and start lying about their bids. So these bids will in fact change. You can't expect people to continue telling you the truth when you're screwing up the way you're paying them. But in any case, if you did have the true bids, this would be the cost of running the auction, and these would be the payments. So you would be paying 10 for the 500 megawatts of regulation, 20 for the 500 megawatts of spinning. You see the difference between these two? This guy is the area of the cleared bids. It's this area plus this area, which is the cost of supplying the product. The total payment is this area plus this area. Okay. Cost and payment are two different things. Okay, and so yeah, on the plus side we get an efficient outcome, but on the minus side we have a lower quality product that gets paid higher. And this happened in reality. So this is data from California in 2000. the worst service is getting 10 times the price of regulation here. Any reasonable trader, even if they could offer regulation, they would rather hold back and sell here. Well, if everybody does that, the system operator won't have any regulation in the end of the day. So this is non-viable. So you have a price reversal here, which is very stands out, and you also have a price reversal here. Okay. So there were different proposals about how to deal with this problem. One idea that resembles the previous auction is that the price you pay for each service is not the price that we got from intersecting the supply and demand bid, but it's the highest accepted bid for that service, even if that bid is not used in that service. I know this sounds like a game of words. So highest accepted bid for regulation, even if regulation is not used for satisfying the regulation demand. What was the highest accepted bid for regulation? If you remember from the example. It's this guy over here. It's an accepted bid. It's not accepted in the regulation market, but eventually it does get accepted somewhere. So the idea was the argument was, okay, we will, since this was originally a regulation bid, we will use this as a regulation clearing price to even out the price as a bid. So that's a slight variant of this option. For the spin reserve market, what would be the price? This is still the highest accepted bid for spin, so it's 20. So what changes with this rule is that you just get an increase in the regulation price by 15. Kind of improves things, it gets the two prices closer, but not quite. Also on the bad side is the system operator now has to pay more money out, because all this money is coming out of the pocket of the system operator. So with this approach, you get $15 for regulation, 20 for spin. The cost is the same as before, but the payments are higher by $7,000, and you still have price reversal. So a third approach that was tested was that, and this is a direct application of the idea I discussed earlier for multi-product auctions, is that we would actually solve a centralized optimization problem, where we are minimizing the cost of reserves, subject to satisfying each reserve demand level. What are these constraints doing here? If I equals 1 corresponds to, let's write these out. I equals 1 corresponds to demand for regulation. So the first constraint for I equals 1, well, in the paper I'm referring to there are 4, but here we only have 2. So for regulation, what this constraint is saying is that I will sum from 1 to 1, so only regulation bids, and I will take the 2 generators that offered regulation, and I want to make sure that their total offer of regulation exceeds my regulation demand. That's what the constraint is saying for I equals 1. For I equals 2, so here instead of 1 I'm writing RG. So 1, the index 1 corresponds to regulation. For I equals 2, demand for regulation plus demand for spin is whatever, yeah, I screwed it up here. So whatever this guy bid for regulation plus spin, plus whatever the other guy bid for regulation plus spin. Which means what? Any extra bids from the regulation market can cascade down to the spin market. That's basically what these constraints are doing. They're doing exactly what we did earlier manually, but the important reason we're solving this problem is not to get the optimal allocation, but is to get the prices that we need to send out. And when you apply this idea, it actually, you can show through linear programming arguments that higher quality products will never be priced lower. And it turns out that for this example, both products receive a clearing price of 20 if you were to run the auction this way. So the rule of the auction would be, you guys give me your R's and your costs, I run this optimization problem, and I use these two variables as your awards. If you run it this way, you actually get level prices. And the problem, the complaint people had was that, well, in the end, you end up paying $20,000 per hour, so the amount of money you end up paying generators to give them the proper incentives is the same if you had let them lie, and you would have lost the same amount of money if they had lied. And it's not, you know, by raising the prices out of the roof to make them say the truth. Sure, you're getting them to do what you want them to do, but they get away with the extra surplus anyways. You're surrendering the extra surplus to them in any case. So this sequential clearing was a topic of debate in the industry, and the way things are done today is the way I described to you earlier. We have simultaneous energy and reserves clearing by solving the dispatch problem for both products at the same time.